From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We're going to spend the next hour getting you updated on the news that made headlines around our region this last week. And today our panel includes Daniel Ramirez with EastIdahoNews.com, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Ooh, happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
So let's get started, everyone, because some folks may not know this. We have an election coming up on May 20th. You may have just heard our Troy Oppie mention this in the newscast before we came on the air. But Clark, today is a really important deadline. But before we get to the deadline, can you tell us what will be on the ballot come May 20th?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. And it's a local election, and it's actually going to be different depending on which county and which school district Idahoans live in. And so the things that are going to be up for vote on May 20th could include an auditorium district, a school bond issue or supplemental levy, a highway district, a hospital district, a library district, a water and sewer district. And so it's some of those smaller local type elections or school bonds and levies that'll be up for a vote. And if you have just a second, I can give you an easy way for voters to find out what's actually going to be up for vote in their neighborhood on their ballots. And all they have to do,
yeah, I think that'd be great, Clark.
Yeah, for sure. Gemma, all they have to do is go to voteidaho.gov. That's the official voting website for the state of Idaho. It's run by the Secretary of State's office. And so when you go to voteidaho.gov, the first thing you see is some information about the May 20th election. But then there's a couple of cool tools that they've built into this website in the last couple of years. But you can actually click from that website and find your sample ballot. And so you just enter some basic information about yourself if you're a registered voter. And it can actually pull up the sample ballot that you would get on May 20th. And so I pulled mine up. I live in Boise. And the only thing I actually have on my ballot for May 20th is the Greater Boise Auditorium District is having an election for its members. And so there's 2 6-year terms for the Greater Boise Auditorium District up for vote on May 20th. And that's what many Boise residents are going to have. But depending on where you live in Idaho, there could be school bond and levy questions, a highway district, those other sorts of things. And so it's going to be different for each person, Gemma, just depending on where they live and what jurisdiction they live in.
Mm-hmm. So, Clark, I mentioned a deadline for today. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. Today's an important deadline because it's the deadline to register to vote online for that May 20th election. And I can kind of break down sort of what that means. But people who really need to keep this in mind is anybody who is going to be planning to vote by absentee ballot for this May 20th election that we've been talking about. And so why does that matter? Well, there's a deadline in May to request an absentee ballot, but before voters can request an absentee ballot, they have to be registered to vote, right? And so that's where today's deadline comes in. But if voters aren't registered, or if they need to update their registration details, like if they've moved since the last election last year or something like that, they can do all of that through that same voteidaho.gov website that we've been talking about. So if you need to register to vote, if you want to request an absentee ballot, if you need to update your voter registration information, you can do all of that at voteidaho.gov. You can look at your sample ballot to see exactly what's going to be up for election on May 20th, so you can do your research and kind of prepare for how you're going to vote on that. And so today's deadline really is important, like I said, for anybody looking to vote by absentee ballot, because Jim, I know you remember, and I know a lot of Idaho Matters listeners will know this, but you can actually register to vote when you show up to the polls on election day in Idaho. That's a law that we have in Idaho. So if you're planning to vote in person, you can register to vote in person when you show up at your polling location on May 20th. But where today's deadline really matters is if you're looking to vote by absentee ballot, then you need to make sure that you're registered so that you can request your absentee ballot by the May 9th deadline. That's kind of how those two things work together. But a lot of people may not know about that election. You know, it's not an election where we have the governor up or our legislators or even our city council members in the spring. And so it may not be something that's really on people's radars. And so it is a good reminder. It's also a good reminder that you can check your polling location, update your voter registration details, and all that sort of good stuff so that you don't have any kind of a delay when you show up to vote, or there's no snag or anything like that when you're hoping to request your absentee ballot. So it's an election that really flies under the radar. But we've talked about on the show over the years about how these local decisions with school bonds and levies, and about how these local jurisdictions do make a big impact on Idahoans' lives. And so it's a good reminder to start thinking about, Gemma, for sure. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, I was going to say, Clark, I mean, I think you're so right with people forgetting that we even have an election coming up. I mean, I didn't know until recently, and I had to do what you did, Clark, go and look to see, well, is there even anything on the ballot where I live? But I mean, but Clark, can you talk really quickly too about when you know, there's going to be a lot of things up when it comes to schools, and I know a lot of times, you know, schools have to put their elections on these ballots, right? Like they can't do it like in the November election.
There's only so many election days on the calendar each year, Gemma, and the legislature kind of establishes that by law. But this is, I used to work for Idaho Education News for a long time with our friend Kevin Richard and all that. And so I was used to covering education budgets and education elections. And this really is an important election for the school districts. And not every school district has a bond or a levy up for election right now. But it's important because this is the time of year when school districts are really looking ahead to the next school year that begins in the fall. They're doing negotiations with their teachers for their contracts and setting pay for teachers and staff for next school year. And they're really starting to get built up for that next year, right? Because the legislature's just finished. They just set the public school education budgets, and now we're transitioning to where we implement that at the local level. And districts are going through right now with kind of what their needs are and what their anticipated enrollments are going to be, and really making those plans for next school year. And so this can be a very important election day for school districts, and historically has been. But you're right, the state of Idaho does limit the number of days when there can be elections, and there's only so many days a year when they can even have those elections. And so it's a good thing to be thinking about, and it kind of easily flies under the radar, right? Because we don't have a big congressional election this year. The governor's not up, the legislators aren't up, or anything like that with this election. So that's a real easy one to fly under the radar there, Gemma.
And Christina, the League of Women Voters want to make sure folks know who's running for library board positions in the Treasure Valley. So can you quickly tell us who the League of Women Voters is?
Sure. The League of Women Voters is an organization that's been around for over 100 years. It was founded I think in 1920, and it's a national organization, but there are many chapters here in Idaho, kind of all over the state. There's one in Pocatello that I'm really familiar with. I'm from Pocatello, so I know I've interviewed them and talked to them about some of their events. There's one in Kootenai County, Moscow, Lewis and Clark Valley, and then definitely here in the greater Boise district, we have a very active league. And it's important for people to know that the league, they themselves say this, that that they don't endorse candidates or say that you shouldn't vote for a specific candidate, but they are a political organization. Their main goal is to connect voters with the information that they need to vote. So going back to some of the things that Clark was talking about, voter registration and how to do that, how to find your polling place, they're really interested in helping people understand those issues. But another part of what they do is hold forums and things like that so that people can come and hear from candidates themselves. So another function of the League of Women Voters is that often they'll come and testify before the legislature, often on bills that tend to make it harder for people to vote. The League is very much a proponent of making voting easy and understandable, making sure that people have a voice in their government.
So the League of Women Voters is holding some forums. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so the League of Women Voters of Idaho will host two public forums, one for the Ada County Free Library District and the other for the Meridian Library District. They have some Board of Trustee seats open in that May 20th election that Clark was talking about. And so all of those candidates for those two library districts in Ada County and Meridian have been invited to these public open forums so that voters can hear their stances on particular issues. Libraries have been in the news quite a bit the last few years with some of the policy changes that the Idaho legislature has looked at. And there's a lot of in North Idaho, there's some restructuring of some of the library networks and things like that. So as Clark was saying, some of these elections tend to fly under the radar, but these are actually really important positions, especially particularly in this moment. So the Ada County Free Library District Forum will be held from 6 to 8 p.m. on April 30th in Star at the Star River House on Main Street. And the Meridian Library District Forum will be held from 6 to 7:30 p.m. on May 7th at the Meridian Library on Cherry Lane. So it's a great opportunity for people to go and actually hear from the candidates themselves. The league will also staff these events with literature and other information on how to vote, how to register, how to find your polling place, those kind of things. It's just a really good opportunity to connect with the people that are holding these important positions, even if they are a little bit more local or a little bit, I always say that the closer that you are to government, the more local the elections are. Honestly, the more important that those elections matter and the more your vote matters. Because these elections do fly under the radar, there's fewer people that come out to vote. So if you do tend to vote in these elections, your vote it essentially goes further because there's fewer people voting in them. But people should show up for these elections just as much as they do for the president or for congressional things. They do decide, really important issues in our backyard. So I'd encourage people to look at our little story on idahocapitalsun.com to get those details of where they can find these forums and how to participate.
All right. Daniel, some more news coming out about Lori Vallow Daybell as she was just in trial in Arizona. Can you tell us about this latest trial?
Yeah, definitely. So our news director and our reporter, Nate Egan, has been down in Arizona since the start of the trial back at the end of March. And yeah, as you said, Lori Vallow was found guilty of conspiracy to kill her estranged husband, Charles Vallow, in 2019. And this trial, since the end of March and up until last Tuesday, or this Tuesday, it's been a busy week over here. Um, yeah, she was just in trial,
And so they
yeah,
had a verdict, correct? So what
yes.
so what was the verdict on this?
Yeah, so as I said, she was found guilty of conspiracy, and this marks one of two trials that Lori will face here in Arizona. Uh, the first was Charles Valor, right? And then the second is conspiracy to murder her nephew, her niece, Brandon Brudeau. Uh,
Mhm.
though Lori Vallow was found guilty of conspiracy for murder of Charles Vallow, she won't be sentenced here soon. She'll be sentenced after the trial of conspiracy to murder Brandon Brudeau. Uh, she's already serving 3 life sentences for killing her kids here in Idaho. As many of you remember, back in
Mhm.
2023, Lori Vallow was brought on charges for conspiracy to murder JJ, Tylee, and I think Tammy Daybell. Uh,
Mhm.
and then last year, her husband, Charles Val, or not Charles. There's a lot of
Or Chad Daybell. Chad
Chad
Daybell was
Daybell.
also
There's been
sentenced. Yes.
a lot of
There's a
years
lot going
before.
on with this. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So she
sure.
will not be sentenced for this Arizona latest trial for a while, but both she and Chad Daybell are in, I believe, prison for life. They both got life
Yes,
sentences.
yes. Lori Vallow's serving 3 life sentences here, and with if she is sentenced for this, just for specifically this one, she faces 25 years to life.
Drew, some controversial methods are being used to sell off some land south of Cascade. Can you first tell us about this land, which is being called Legacy Creek Ranch, correct?
That's right. So just to orient everybody first and foremost where we're talking about. So you're driving up along Idaho 55. There's that Clear Creek Station, where the northern half of the building is painted like University of Idaho, and the southern
Mm,
half is painted like Boise State. So if you
hmm.
turn right there on what's called Clear Creek Road, I think it's also known as Forest Service Road 409. And then you head east a little ways, kind of back up into the hills, into the forest. That's where we're talking about this Legacy Creek Ranch project. And essentially what it is somewhere in the nature of about 2,000 acres of land owned by the Wilkes brothers, the Texas billionaires, Dan and Ferris Wilkes. And that what they've done is they've carved out what they're calling ranch sites, 73 of them, in this little offering, if you will.
Okay, so with that said, Drew, how are the Wilkes brothers being able to bypass subdivision rules when that are currently in place in order to sell this land?
Yeah, so that's kind of I guess a benefit of being a large landowner is that they did not technically subdivide the land to create these 73 ranch sites. What they
Hmm.
did was they were able to basically reorganize the parcel lines, and then as well as they created 18 new parcels. So there's this kind of interesting loophole, if you will, in Valley County's code where the subdivision rules were created in 1970. At the time that that happened, there was what were known as original parcels. And so these original parcels that existed at the time of the subdivision rules that were created, uh,
Hmm.
they were entitled to one, what do you call a free split. And so most of those original parcels in the, 50, 55 years since then, they have taken those free splits since then, and all splits are now subject to the subdivision rules. Well, the Wilkes brothers had a couple, 18 of them, that they were able to take those free splits, create 18 new parcels, and then reorganize the parcel lines with all their existing land to carve out these 73 ranch sites. And so what you get is um, it looks like a subdivision, it quacks like a subdivision. It's not subject to subdivision rules, which that means,
Okay.
it's not Valley County Planning and Zoning doesn't review it. State agencies don't review it. There's no guarantee that any of these sites will be able to get septic systems. The Wilkes brothers have not had to do any sort of wildfire mitigation, establish plans or irrigation, stormwater drainage, you name it. None of that stuff has happened. And so, this thing is being marketed like a subdivision. If it sounds familiar, it's probably because you've seen it on billboards in Boise on State Street. It's in the Boise airport. It's on social media. It's in the
Hmm.
newspapers. At first blush, you would certainly say, "Oh yes, this must be a subdivision," but it's
Hmm.
not. So it's kind of one of those buyer beware things.
Okay, good to know. So, Clark, Real ID is about to start, and it could hinder folks' travel plans if they don't have it. So, let's begin with this. What is Real ID?
Yeah, for sure, Jim. And this has been a long time coming. But the
Uh-huh.
real ID, you may have heard of the Idaho Star Card. That's what Idaho's version of it is. But it's a new form of enhanced identification and driver's license that the states are adopting. The law was actually passed by Congress, I think, in like 2005, and it was a response to the 9/11 Commission's report and recommendations, but basically calling for some uniform enhanced features on state issued driver's licenses is essentially what the real ID is nationally. All states are in the same situation. It's not just an Idaho thing, but in Idaho, our version of the real ID is called the Idaho Star Card.
Okay, so Clark, when does it take effect and what does it mean if you don't have that star card?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. Just under 2 weeks. It's actually on May 7th is when TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, is going to start enforcing the real ID laws. And so who this really applies to is passengers going to airports. What this really is going to come into a play is going to be at airport security checkpoints. Also, certain other federal buildings, maybe like a federal courthouse or the Idaho National Laboratory, perhaps. But really,
Hmm.
where this is going to affect people is at the airport security checkpoint. And so, starting May 7th, less than 2 weeks, is when TSA is going to start enforcing these real ID requirements. If you don't have it, there are a couple of other forms of ID that are acceptable. If you have a US passport, that's the easiest thing. That's acceptable still to get through, obviously, airport security checkpoints. And so if you have a passport, if you're traveling with a passport, you're in good shape. You don't have to worry as much about this real ID deadline as long as you're traveling with your passport. Even if you're just traveling in the US, though, is the thing to keep in mind. But for people who don't have a US passport or don't have a military ID or don't have a federally recognized tribal ID, then it could get really difficult for them to travel if they don't have the star card. I got a series of press releases from the Idaho Transportation Department over the last 2 weeks, and what they're saying is it could cause people to miss their flights if they don't
Hmm.
have the Idaho Star Card, if they don't have the real ID or another form of ID like a U.S. passport at this time. They could be detained, they could be subject to enhanced interrogation and identification screening, or they could just be not allowed to the gate. And so, what the word is from the Idaho Transportation Department is for folks who don't have it after May 7th, if they don't have any of the acceptable forms of ID, they could miss their flight. Is I think what it really comes down to, Gemma.
So, Clark, does this apply to everyone? I mean, I'm thinking of little kids, right? I mean, like
18,
you
yeah,
don't.
thanks so much for asking. It's everyone 18 and older who is subject to
Okay.
this Real ID and Idaho Star Card regulation. If you're getting the Star Card, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. A lot of DMV locations and counties are on appointment only basis, and appointments are a little delayed right now with the Star Card Real ID deadline coming up. There's also several forms of documents and identification that folks need to get in order to get their
Hmm.
Idaho Star Card. We talked a little bit about how it's an enhanced form of identification. And so, along with that, there's some additional documents that people will need to have to prove their identity, their date of birth, their social security number, and their residency. And if you go to the Idaho Transportation Department's website, there's a checklist of the documents that you'll need to get your Star Card. We also have an article in the Idaho Capital Sun that came out earlier this week that talks about the Real ID deadline. It talks about the documents you need to get your Star Card in Idaho, and it also talks about how you can use a passport, a military ID, or a tribal ID when you are at the airport if you don't have the Star Card yet. So it is a little overwhelming, and there's a lot to keep in mind with the documents folks need. But luckily, through the Idaho Transportation Department's website, there's kind of a checklist and some
Hmm.
information about the Star Card. But folks, especially if they have spring flights, and they don't have a U.S. passport, really need to be taking steps to get their Idaho Star Card. One final tip that the Transportation Department passed along is that you can go to any county DMV office in Idaho to get your real ID. If you live in Boise, you don't just have to go to Ada County, which is good news because a friend of mine checked, and it was about 3 weeks out to get an appointment at any of
Oh.
the Ada County DMV offices. So maybe you want to be looking at Gem County or Boise County or some of the other counties in the area if you have a flight in early May, knowing that May 7th deadline is out there, and it may just take a little bit of time to get this process moving, Gemma.
Right, because folks, remember, as Clark said, it's for any flights. So you don't have to be flying out of the United States. So May 7th is that deadline when they're going to start checking for this. So just be prepared and be aware of that. So Drew, I want to talk about a recent executive order by President Trump, which is making the Stibnite mine in Valley County a top priority. Can you first just remind us about this mine, where it is, what does it produce?
Absolutely. So it's in the far eastern reaches of Valley County. It's about 40 air miles east of McCall, kind of in the Yellow Pine area. And currently it produces nothing, but Perpetua Resources, they would like to change that soon. It would produce primarily gold and antimony, as well as a little bit of silver.
Okay, so um, tell us why the proponents of this mine want this project to go forward, to succeed, and also it's being called a transparency project. Do I have that right?
That's right. That's right. So the Transparency Project designation, that's part of the executive order by President Trump. And essentially, what it means is that it will receive priority for permitting, increased interagency collaboration, expedited permitting where possible, those sorts of things. It's kind of unclear what that actually means on the ground, but that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
the big picture of it. What's
Oh,
interesting for this project in particular is that it's already essentially been approved by the Payette National Forest, which is the lead permitting agency for the mine. There's an 8-year environmental review of this that kind of just came to a close at the start of this year. That's still being finalized, but we're kind of in the ninth inning of this one.
mhm.
Um,
So there are people though who really do not want this moving forward, and some of these are conservationists. So talk to us a little bit about that, Drew.
Absolutely. So back in, I think it was February, several conservation groups, including the Idaho Conservation League, sued the Forest Service for the approval that it issued in January for the mine. And essentially, their argument is that the approval does not comply with federal environmental regulations, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, things like that. That is still working its way through U.S. District Court. Um, I just saw recently that Perpetua has joined on as an intervener, defendant in that suit, and so Perpetua and
Mm,
the Forest Service will be working to defend that decision. But one thing that's important to understand with this, as far as the proponents of why they want this mine to go through, and there's a couple different reasons, but I think the one to kind of key in on, especially in light of this executive order, is that the mine would become the first domestic source of mined antimony in the United States. Currently, most of the world's supply of antimony comes from China, other areas in Asia. And back in December, China actually banned exports of antimony to the United States. And back in 2018, the federal government classified antimony as a critical mineral. And
mm.
so that kind of gives you an idea of the federal government's interest in kind of making this happen. Over the last 3 years, the Defense Department has given Perpetua $75 million to advance this project. Because the Defense Department, they need antimony for munitions, mortars, missiles, things of that nature. It's also key for renewable energy, batteries, things like that. And so there's a lot of interest in this antimony side of the project, though make no mistake, this is a gold mine at its core. The antimony represents a very small percentage of the overall profits from the mine, expected to be north of 7 billion, and more than 90% of that is tied to the gold reserves.
So, Christina, on Tuesday, Governor Little issued an executive order directing the Idaho Department of Lands to increase forest management activities in federal forests here in our state. Can you tell us the reasoning behind this order?
Along with something that's happening at the federal level, on March 1st, Donald Trump issued a memo titled Freeing Our Forests Act, and it was signed by President Trump. Oh, excuse me, that was an executive order from Trump.
Hmm.
And so states across the West, including Idaho and Utah, the governors have come together and said that these Western states will work together with federal management on federal land, especially when it relates to timber. President Trump has also issued an executive order that calls for more timber harvests on public lands, citing an emergency. And so I think what Governor Little is after here is working with the federal government. Last year, during our pretty horrific wildfire and smoke season, the governor really came out pretty harshly against the federal government by not doing more
Hmm.
to stop wildfires when they're starting. We had a couple of fires that really grew into, massive acreage burned, and he really was coming down hard on the federal government for not managing these lands so that we do get these more catastrophic fires. And so I think this is a way for, in Little's view, to work with the federal government a little bit more, allow the state to have more management on the federal land in Idaho, which is pretty extensive. Idaho is 60% federal land, and so what happens on those federal lands really does affect all of us.
So, Clark, the governor lined out, as Christina mentioned, these forest management activities and what they would be. Can you tell us what these forest management activities are and how they will work?
Yeah, for sure, Jim. I think that's a good question. So when we're looking at this executive order and we're talking about this increased partnership and active forest management, I think what we're really talking about, some of the activities that Governor Little called out in his announcement, we're talking about timber harvest, we're talking about prescribed burns, we're talking about mechanical thinning, and we're also talking about state wildland firefighters teaming up with the feds for what Governor Little called an aggressive initial attack during the peak of wildfire season. And I think Christina did a really good job of teeing it up. I think what this represents
Hmm.
is a change in tone from the governor. And that's not surprising, right? Because we have a new administration and a new Forest Service chief, Tom Schultz, who's the
Uh-huh.
former director of the Idaho Department of Lands, former executive with the Idaho Forest Product Group and the timber industry. And so I think it's really a shifting of tones where last year, especially in response to the Wapiti fire, which burned a lot of forest area throughout central Idaho, we really heard, like Christina said, the governor critical of the federal government. Now with the new administration, he's calling for them to team up, but he's calling for the state to take a more active role on federal public lands, which I think is also important here. But when we talk about forest management activities, we're talking about timber harvest, the prescribed burns that they do, where they plan a burn to remove some fuels or to remove some timber there, mechanical thinning, and then that aggressive initial attack. So it's a very different approach. And Governor Little even basically came out and said that. He said under the previous administration, under President Biden, he said the Idaho Department of Lands and the state of Idaho was really limited to two small areas where it could help team up with the federal government to expand those forest management activities.
Hmm.
And so I think that they're seeing with more of their allies in power at the federal level, with Idahoans in charge of, or Idahoans receiving some of these key appointments to the Forest Service and Undersecretary of the Interior. I think they're looking to work together more, but also enhance the state's role. This would be kind of a new thing, and so when we talk about fire season, that really ramps up in May, June, July, August. And so I think that's something that a lot of us will be following to see what that looks like, how they're working together or not, what the changes are,
Hmm.
what the results are. And so it would be a new thing and kind of a shift, Jim. And so I think a lot of people will be following it closely to see just how it's implemented, just how it's handled, and what some of the results are. And this is just kind of the very beginning phase of it. It's just something that was announced, but Christina's right. Utah also passed a similar executive order, and it is some of these particularly Republican controlled Western states coming together. And so it's something that's really going to be something that we'll watch as we get into what is traditionally the fire season, Gemma.
Well, absolutely, Clark. I mean, especially as you said, I mean, we might have another, bad fire season. We don't know. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out. So, Drew, tell us about a geothermal system that actually has the potential to heat the entire town of Cascade.
Yeah, so this would actually be really similar to the city of Boise's, geothermal
Hmm.
system downtown. I think it heats something like 88 or 90 buildings in downtown
Something like
Boise.
that. Yeah.
Largest system in the country, so it's quite impressive. Essentially, Cascade's looking at doing that same thing. They would tap into heated groundwater It ranged between, 70 degrees to about 100 degrees, and then run pipelines to homes, businesses that would either extract the heat from that water or dump heat from their building into the water to cool it. It's kind of it's almost hard for me to get my head around, but I don't work in HVAC, so.
Okay, with that said, though, how much of this is a dream versus a reality? Because I'm assuming there's a cost involved to this.
There is, and you know what? I think it's probably more of a matter of time. The city of Cascade already has, or within the city, anyways, there are already 7 geothermal wells, and so we're already kind of tapped into that resource. What the city is studying right now, and what they've received a $200,000 grant to kind of fund this work, is essentially the feasibility of building out that network, establishing distribution lines that would then take this resource throughout the city and enable the individual homeowner or business owner to then
Mm,
tap into it. We don't
okay.
know what that cost looks like just yet, but what we do know is that if that does come to fruition, homes or businesses that tap in would potentially see up to 66% cost savings relative to electric heat or propane heat.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
and what's interesting is there are actually 2 buildings already in Cascade that for many years have been using this geothermal heat. The Cascade Aquatic Center, they've been heating the pool and the concrete around the pool for over a decade. And then the Cascade school system as well has been heating the school
Hmm.
building with geothermal heat since 2004. So it's already happening, but the idea is hopefully to make it happen on a larger scale.
Okay. So, Daniel, before we go to break, an iconic Pocatello store is closing. Tell us why Mike's Music decided to close up shop.
Yeah, so for many people who live in Pocatello, or used to live in Pocatello, Mike's Music is probably a common name in their household. And unfortunately, the Pocatello location is closing. And one of the reasons given by the owners is most of it's due to e-commerce, right? A lot of people are now shopping online nowadays. It's easier to shop online now. And people aren't going into these brick and mortar stores anymore, which has
Hmm.
really affected the business for Mike's Music.
Drew, the McCall City Council just said no to a proposal to have rentals. We're talking like jet skis and boats available at Legacy Park. Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, so it was kind of a landscape changing decision in the sense that these jet ski rentals have been staged on Legacy Beach all the way back to 2008. I mean, that's kind of been a constant during the summer. It was through Cheap Thrills rentals, and you would essentially rent through them, and then you just go down to the beach, and the jet skis are right there and ready to go. That won't be the case anymore. Cheap Thrills had already decided against renewing that agreement with the city for this year, in light of some new boat ramp fees that the city has been putting in place. That process started
Hmm.
last summer, and they're tweaking them for this summer. Um, I talked to Cheap Thrills, and they essentially said, it's not worth it. They didn't want to fool with it. And at the very last minute, the deadline was February 28th. The city received another application from a rental company called Mountain Meadows Adventures, and they were essentially looking to do the same thing. And the council, they as the summer tourist season and as the summer boating season has gotten, busier and busier through the years, the council has felt that, the public beach space, which is so limited as it is simply too valuable to be putting any kind of commercial operation in place. And so on those grounds, they said no. And this summer, Legacy Beach will not have rental jet skis staged for, like I said, the first time in almost 20 years.
So here's what I found interesting, Drew, about this decision because it actually went against the city of McCall's Parks and Recreation director. So what did he have to say about this?
That's right. So Kurt Wolf, the McCall Parks and Recreation Director, he and the city staff recommended going forward with this concession proposal. It would have paid the Parks Department $10,000 for one, so that certainly doesn't hurt.
Hmm.
But more importantly, I think from their standpoint is that by staging these jet skis on the beach, And there was also going to be a public dock component. So some of it would be staged there. Essentially, it reduces congestion at the boat ramp itself. There's only one public boat ramp. Um, well, there's two, but one of them is in Ponderosa State Park, and then the other
Mm-hmm.
public boat ramp is the city ramp right there at Legacy Beach. And from the Parks Department standpoint, they want to reduce congestion as much as possible. I don't know if you've been down there on a Saturday afternoon in July, but
Uh-huh.
it can be pretty hectic, pretty crazy. And so the thought was that, well, by taking rentals and kind of having them already established, they're not intermingling in that constant flow of traffic that's trying to get in and off of the lake. But the council disagreed.
Well, and because the council cited public opposition, right? Saying, well, residents don't want this.
That's right. And there was, I wouldn't call it overwhelming, but there was certainly some public comments opposed to allowing this Legacy Beach concession. I think just generally speaking, the local residents in the McCall area get very much so fatigued with the
Mm-hmm.
tourism and the traffic and the congestion. And as you know, all things pay at lake are top priority. And so this kind of falls right in line with that.
All right, appreciate that update. So Daniel, tell us about this new exhibit at the Museum of Idaho. But first, for folks who aren't aware, the Museum of Idaho, it's in Idaho Falls, correct?
Yep, that is correct.
All right, so this new exhibit, I think this sounds really cool. So talk to us about this because it's giving folks a glimpse into the past.
Yeah. So one of the signs in this exhibit, dates back to the 1910s. It's the old American sign for an old cinema theater that now is a great harvest if you come here to present day Idaho Falls. And yeah, they just have a lot of old signs, just from Idaho's past. One of them including the old Bonneville Hotel, and you can see where the old light bulbs used to stick in there to make them light up at night. Disco chandeliers when disco fever came to the United States in the 70s and 80s. But it's also kind of a call for help too, as one of the signs in the exhibit is missing. Um, it's a
Oh.
sign promoting a stinker station. I know there's one on Vista in Boise, so a lot of residents know what a stinker station is.
Hmm.
But yeah, it went missing a few days before the museum actually went to collect it. And so they're asking the public to help them find it.
Oh my goodness. Right. And folks, you should go to eastidahonews.com and just look at the story that was written because you've got pictures up there of some of these signs because they're old signs, business signs, and they're really fascinating. But yeah, Daniel, you have one right on there where the stinker sign is supposed to be, and it's a stinker station sign missing. So I kind of love that they're trying to solve this mystery at the same time.
Yeah, and it's one
So
of those signs where you see it, it's always been there, but when you look for it, it's just gone.
oh my goodness. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for taking time out of your really busy schedules to spend the last hour with us. Thank you to our panelists, Daniel Ramirez with EastIdahoNews.com, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, Christina Lords, she is the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, and Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.